here's a tune called the Glen Road to Carrick, very well known tune up in the northwest in Donegal.
And what a great way to open the second episode of the Attic Sessions, which is just basically a chance to get some brilliant people up in our attic to talk about music, poetry, the world. So my name is Nessa O'Mahony. Peter Salisbury is behind the camera, and we are delighted to say today, by two fantastic musicians, poets, Tony Curtis and Dermot McLaughlin, who you've just heard. So I'll introduce him first. And he is a Donegal fiddler, born in Derry, and learned his music from some masters like Con Cassidy and James Byrne. So I'm going to begin asking him a bit about that. And he has been performing. He's been on the road for the last while, and he also does a bit of teaching, master classes, and we're going to find out a bit more about that. And beside him is Tony Curtis, who is a renowned Dublin poet. He told me, published about 16 volumes, including 10 collections. He regularly works with children in schools, regularly contributes to the Clifton Arts Festival. His most recent volume is a book called Approximately in the Key of C, right, which we'll be talking about in a minute and hearing some work from. And he edited As the Poet Said, which was a selection of quotations from Dennis O'Driscoll's regular column in Poetry Ireland Review. So we're just thrilled to have both of you here. We asked you both because we know that you're terrific musicians, but you're brilliant people to talk to, and I've known both of you for years. So it's an absolute thrill to have you here. So I'm really curious to find out what started it off for both of you. That what launched Dermot as the traditional musician? Like, did you grow up hearing it? What made you want to play it?
Well, when I was growing up in Derry, the house I grew up in was very musical. It was full of music. Both my parents had a big interest in music, and they could both knock a tune out of different instruments. My mother could play a wee bit on the piano. My father would try his hand at anything. He drew the line at the uilleann pipes and the bagpipes. He couldn't get his he couldn't get on top of them, but he always had a wee melodeon in the house and a Jew's harp, tin whistle, a fiddle. I still have his old fiddle. So we always had that around the place, and we were encouraged. I suppose in our house, I would say, looking back, one of the great things my parents passed on to us was curiosity about things. So if there was a thing lying there, you could footer about at it. And we learned to read music. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters, so we learned to read music at home, which was handy as well. And that was a really good start. Did some classes in classical music on piano and on classical violin, but always kind of gravitated towards traditional music. But I would have to say that the soundtrack in our house was very diverse. I mean, there was a lot of classical music and traditional music. It was all music, really. Labels weren't a big issue, I don't think. And then, like, learning to play the fiddle, traditional music, was a great thing, because alongside that, I was doing classical music and then school orchestra and stuff like that. So it was great to get the best of both worlds. Yeah. But I should say as well, Nessa, like, when I was growing up, I was born in 1961 in Derry. So learning traditional music during the 1960s and 70s, during the conflict times, was I suppose it had an awful lot more meaning than just playing tunes, because for me there was a big thing there about your identity. I think it belonged to us, you know, and I suppose there was, even though I wouldn't have said it at the time, there was definitely a strong political motivation to pick up this music and look after it and learn as much as I could about it, as I did with Irish language as well. But overall, it's a thing that I find is all about enjoyment and adventure. I often say to people, like, if I'm teaching in a class, you know, and I've got youngsters in the class, I try to tell them, like, not to be worried about doing it right or wrong. First of all, if you imagine when you lift this thing up, you're stepping on a magic carpet and you don't know exactly where it's going to end up, so you just do your best. And that's kind of the attitude I found from a lot of the older players I learned from as well. It's not that there's a specific method for learning, you pick it up, but the way you pick up language.
So Tony, for you, like, which came first, music or poetry?
I don't know. You couldn't say I had a career in poetry. You don't suddenly one day. And there was no music in my house. No, my father didn't play an instrument. My mother didn't play an instrument. And there was a lot of religion in our house. My father's three brothers were Cistercian monks in a silent order down in Roscrea, Mount St. Joseph's. So I was probably product of the 60s, in that I would have listened to Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, Leonard Cohen. And before we had televisions, as kids, we sat on the street. So the whole street, everybody on the street played the guitar, whether they were good, bad, or whichever way, sideways. But I remember from being very young and playing the guitar, we said, let's learn a song. And I was always the one saying, no, let's write a song. So I always had that idea of making a... My granny used to call me Odd, in that she called all my brothers by their names, Brian, Philip, David, but she always says, where's Odd? In that I looked at... I always had the other extra question. And then I started writing songs. We used to play places like Universal Folk Club, and eventually... I was no good at school. The only thing I was good at was poetry, or was it English. I had a very good memory.
So from what age were you actually putting poems down on?
No, I wasn't. I was writing songs. Okay. I wasn't really until I went to London, and then for as evening classes, Blake Morrison did an evening class in creative writing. I used to go to just for a bit of crack. Every night I used to go to a different course in Goldsmiths College, and one was creative writing with Blake Morrison. And that class was fascinating, because the people who were in it, Alan Jenkins, Wendy Cope, Freddie Gear, Vicky Fever. So that little pamphlet from 1979 and 1980, and fascinating who was in that.
But so that was a bit later on, I suppose. So
that was later on. The music was. I'm a failed rock and roll. Unlike Dermot, I'm a failed rock and roll star.
I'm a failed rock and roll star.
I'm a failed rock and roll star. So I still play, but where I play nowadays, I play in the asylums, and I play in the prisons, and I play in the schools. My father used to always say that to me. I notice you always play where people can't escape.
Because you were saying just a little earlier that like when you work with like very small kids in schools, you bring in Dylan.
Oh yes, Dylan. I don't tell them it's Dylan, but they wouldn't know who he is. It's like when I go into little people, like last week I was in a school called St. Francis in Balmain, and when I walked into the class and you say I'm the poet, or if you say the word poet, it's like saying I'm the washing machine. It doesn't mean anything to them other than they think you're on a spin cycle. So. But it just developed. I'm with Robert Graves. Writing poetry isn't a career, it's a disease, it's an affliction, it's a kind of a curse, and it's a blessing. But the way I go about making poetry, I become obsessed by a subject. So you notice most of my books have a theme. My first book had bicycles and stones, and then I published my third book, and somebody said in the Irish Times that Tony Curtis is not a bad poet, but he only writes about Ireland. So I said, I'll show them. So I wrote a book about Tibet. Took me 3 years, but I showed them, didn't I? So that kind of thing. And then I did one about, I love paintings. I'm fascinated by, I can just think of Dorothy Cross. Like, she blows my mind when I go and see her work, what she does to stuff. Donald Teskey's fantastic paintings. Sohoko Blake, Liam Blake's photographs. They all feed me and interest me.
But music definitely does. And one of the things that I'm curious about, like for both of you, is memory, and how you, first of all, you remember the songs, you remember the repertoire. Like, is it like, you know, they say about the London taxi drivers who they have larger hypothalamuses because they have to learn, you know, all of the addresses and stuff. Like, how do you remember the tunes? How do you remember the songs?
Do you know what I think the interesting question is? It's not how we remember as musicians or poets. How do we remember? I think a more interesting question is, why are more people's memories getting weaker or shorter these days? And the reason I'm saying that is, like, it's not to be provocative for the sake of being provocative. It's because if you consider the tradition of, say, music performed on the fiddle, for example. So let's say it's 300 or 400 years old, and in Ireland there wasn't a big history of music publishing, unlike in Scotland. So in Ireland, people who played this music weren't reliant on the text. So what's left? The old memory. But people have been using memory for thousands of years, and various devices or bits of know-how or bits of technology have supplanted that to varying degrees. But the tradition of, or the culture of traditional music, although it's changing all the time, when I got into it, it was very much memory reliant. But what were your props? Your props were things like cassette tapes. You know, so there was a great black market in cassette tapes. But memory is such an important thing, because when you're learning from people in particular, it's not just the notes. You know, the notes, you can nearly say the notes are there relevant, but the notes are the bit that get you into the music. So when I was spending a lot of my early years, like not going to nightclubs and discos and all of that stuff, I was a bit of a square, so I was hanging out with people who were a lot older than me. So if I'm in my 20s, I spent a lot of my weekends travelling to meet people in their 60s and 70s and 80s, and I found that fascinating. I'm so glad I did that. But I would spend hours sitting in a room with somebody, and it could be Con Cassidy, it could be Francie Jarrett, it could be James Byrne. There might be only a handful of tunes played, but all the time you're getting stuff, you know. And so if somebody played me a tune, I'm interested in not just the notes of the tune. I want to see what they do with the bow, how do they hold the fiddle, how does it all fit together, what did they tell me about that tune, like where does it come from. And the memory attached with the music is more than just the notes. Like, it's so embedded in people and place, and like lots of people who are long gone, but there's still a wee bit of them left through the music, and that just passes. It goes through you in a way.
And do you have lots of little notebooks where you've taken physical notes of what you've seen, or have you just absorbed this whole? Like, I'm really curious about how tradition gets passed on in that way.
In my case, I rely a lot on the memory. Occasionally, I would jot down wee fragments of tunes, but that's quite rare even. I noticed over the last couple of years, I would occasionally, occasionally record someone on my phone, but I realised I never listened back to it. Which is really, and then I said to myself, that's a really stupid thing to do. When do you just pay more attention? Because if I didn't have my iPhone or whatever the hell it is, what would I be doing? I would be listening more attentively and have a very good ear and a good memory most of the time. But I know as well from teaching, a thing I discovered in the last couple of years from teaching at more advanced level as well. I used to always say at the start of a class, if you have a device and you want to record something, fire away, record anything you want. Record it all if you like, so whether it was video or sound. And I noticed a few times when it would come to, before we take a break, I would go back over the stuff we'd done in the previous hour or two, and I was kind of surprised at the attrition rate, you know. Very few people, if I says, can somebody start the first tune we did this morning? Because
they were depending on the device to do the remembering for them.
So I realised that, you know, everybody's wasting their time here. You know, I'm wasting my time, you're wasting your time. You've come all this way to do this, and you're not really here. So as a wee experiment for a couple of teaching sessions, I says, let's turn it all off. And let's see how we do it to end. And this is totally non-scientific, but the performance in terms of learning and remembering and playing it back was vastly improved, I have to say. And I do think there's a lesson there for for us all, and it's relevant to traditional music or anything that relies on whatever the 21st century version of oral transmission is going to be. I think if we let the machines or the memory cards take over, we've lost something.
Yeah. No, I agree. I absolutely agree with you. And I'm wondering whether, like, from Tony's point of view, is there an analogue in like the tradition of both music first, but then poetry? Because I know. Yeah,
well, I think what happened when we were sitting in playing football or playing the guitar on those evenings, that everybody just came along and sang a song. Nobody brought along a music sheet, or there was no. It was just you remembered the words. Yeah. Because you remember what you like. Yeah. You sat at home with the record player and you kept putting the needle back and listened to it again and listened to it again. And over the years, I think my mind just has been kind of more trained. Yeah. Well, I was in a school last week and I played the opening of 10 songs to the school children. Just sang, say, the first few lines of a song. I could sing this one, I could sing this one, I could sing this one. And then, and I said, I could sit here all morning singing songs to you. And nobody would say, Tony has a great memory. But if I stood up and recited a sonnet, people are, the idea of remembering a poem is seen as a great feat of memory. Yeah. Whereas if somebody sings, when Christy Moore is singing and has his eyes closed and he's singing the songs, nobody ever says, what a great memory he has. Mm-hmm. Beyonce, for the kids, she's singing, and nobody ever says, when she did the 2 hours at Glastonbury, nobody said at the end of the concert, that girl has some memory. Right? Mm. But if she said a poem, a whole poem, the memory is different with a poem. And I think I've just transferred it. Sometimes when I often say that the poets of my generation were very oral, and we're on stage, and you have to imagine that behind us are the drums and the bass, and they've all left the stage, and there's just you saying them. Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a really interesting point what Tony's saying as well about. Well, in my case, how the memory works, and Derry, and I went to St. Columns in Derry and studied Spanish for O level and A level, and I think it was for the A level. One of the texts was Romancero Gitano by Lorca, and you studied that as much for language as anything. But the teacher we had was a guy called Bob McKim, and he used to do these great things. He used to play tapes of flamenco music and people singing. Sometimes actually singing or incanting the poetry. So you had the text, which was pretty dead on a book, when you're studying verbs and subjunctive moods and all that stuff. But you're hearing us sing, and then it made a gigantic impression on me, to the extent I developed somewhat of an obsession with Andalusia and Cante Hondo and all that stuff. And I can track it right back to a moment in a class where we're studying a poem and the next thing became alive. Yeah. And to some extent, that thing, like the point Tony's making about something about sound and music and rhythm that goes with words, and it makes it a song, or maybe it makes it something else as well.
For me, I have to be attracted to the poet. There's certain types of poetry. I don't like all poetry, right? I have to put that down immediately. Some people say you're the poet. You must like poetry. I say, well, I like some.
But taste. I mean,
taste. Yes, taste. And I'm attracted to a certain type of poet, right? And a lot of them are very oral, and that's what would be the kind of poet I like Michael Hartnett. That'd be my kind of poet.
We were listening to a recording of him last week, actually, that I think Peter Sir and Pat Boren did, and he was doing the Inchicore haiku.
Yeah,
and it was
beautiful.
Just to hear his voice.
Yes,
and
the story that I could tell you the story about the day he recorded that.
Go on.
Because he rang me up. Right? Michael Hartnett rings me up and he says, "Have you got Inchicore haiku, the book?" I says, "Of course I have." He says, "Well, I haven't, right? Could you drop around tomorrow morning? They want me to come to RTE and record it for the, whatever that was called.
The Post Chair or something, was
it? No, it wasn't.
No, it was Dublin 15.
Dublin 15, yeah.
Dublin
We were all on this.
Yeah.
And so I brought it around to him next morning, and then they were coming. And I said, "Now be good and, make sure you're ready when they come and get you." And of course, when they came to collect them, next morning, they couldn't, he was in no fit condition. So they kept going earlier and earlier, and he kept. But anyway, eventually he did it, and he forgot his glasses. So there should be some great photographs of him out in RTE, because they blew up the haiku. Yeah. They blew them up like somebody at Alice in Wonderland into big, and he read them, right? And he was slightly tipsy when he did it, and the sound guy, like Peter, he fixed the sound up beautifully, so he reads them. But anyway, when he was finished, Inchigua Haiku was quite a large book, and he got the book and he folded it in half and stuffed it in his inside pocket, and off he went to the world. And then in 1999, he was living out in Dundrum, opposite Crazy Prices. I'll never forget. And I'd gone to see him because I was going to Australia. And just when I was leaving, he says, "I have something for you." And I says, "Something for me?" He says, "Yeah, we stand there." And he ran upstairs and he brought down Inchigua Haiku. And it was cracked down the middle, right, of the page. And where he folded it, and he handed it to me. He says, me book. He says, "It's your book. Enjoy Australia." And that's the last time I ever saw him.
Oh, wow.
And next time I saw him, I was carrying his coffin. You know.
And you have that book very
I have that
precious.
book. Oh, yes.
Yeah, I'd imagine. Yeah. Because you are somebody who sort of, not extemporizes, that's the wrong word, but you can sort of recite from memory.
I can, but if you ask me to do a poem, I could do loads, but if we're going to talk about this book, I could do certain poems. But if you're going to talk about the title poem, I can't recite that from memory. It's not one I do, but I can read it because it's short.
But I suppose the question is around, like, you know, do poems only fully come alive when you hear them rather than read them?
I don't really know. Some did they come alive? No, I think they're just. I don't know what. I think there's times when you like a poem to hear it read, and there's times when you like to read a poem. Yeah. I think the new thing, that Spotify thing, is fantastic. Like, somebody said to me one time, you have the weirdest Spotify list, because on my Spotify that I play in the car, I have Marianne Moore, Elizabeth Bishop, Ted Hughes, Robert Frost. You can all the poets are reading their own poems. Yeah. Everybody except Walt Whitman. Somebody else does him. But it's great that you can just drive along the car, listen to all these people reading their poems. So
it is hearing.
Hearing is. I've always liked the voice. I always like to hear the voice.
Well, could we hear you reading?
Yeah, I do this one because the title poem of this book is the one I could recite. If you were going to talk about the first poem in the book, I can recite that because I do it in schools. Okay.
Well, do you want to start with that recitation and then?
I could do it, and I could do it if what happens when I do the poem. I do it. Why I can say it is that when I do it in schools, it's about a mole. A little earth creature. And my friend Philip McLaughlin, the great American sculptor, he made a statue of a mole greeting the sun. And as all the kids know, if you study Wind in the Willow, moles are supposed to be blind. So in Wind in the Willow, mole has the big double glazed glasses, bottle tops, isn't it? Bottle ending. And it isn't that they're blind, it's just that living under the ground, pushing away the mud and the stones and the bones and the coffins and the coke tins. What they like to do is come up at night time and just stand in a field and look at things far away. And the further away they are, the better. Do you understand? Yeah. That's what they like to do. So I wrote this poem for my friend Philip McLaughlin, the sculptor. And he got my poem in the Cisco Gallery and he put it on the wall of the gallery from the floor to the ceiling. And in the middle, he stuck the mole greeting the sun. See, and what I usually do is, see this one here, Southern Cross Flying Fox, Benny's there. I usually get somebody in the class to be the mole. Do you understand, Dermot?
I do.
And he reads the constellations out.
Okay.
As if he is the mole. So for the purpose of this poem, maybe you be the mole.
Okay.
You see? And this is called, so this is the first poem in the book, and it's called The Mole and the Cosmos. I have taken down a piece of the night sky just for the night. At Mole's suggestion, I have put it by the window where it looks glorious against the mountains. Some say moles are blind, but it's just that they like to look at things far away, like stars. Sometimes when I step out to look at the night sky, I have to ask Mole what's what and where's where. And Mole, as if he were a poor country fellow naming wildflowers, lists off the constellations.
Southern Cross, Flying Fox, Bernice's Hare, Winged Horse, Great Dog, Water Bearer, Painter's Easel, Chained Maiden.
Mole's deep voice, sunk like the roots of a tree, sturdy, reassuring, you just know he's right.
Fantastic.
Sorry,
fantastic.
the voice was going there.
Give yourself a slug of the water.
Slug of water, yeah.
I'll ask you about, before you read approximately in the key of C, and there's a great line in there about care and precision in the making of the uilleann pipes that you're describing. Is that part of the attraction for you, that you need equal care and precision in the sort of the writing in the poem and the making of the music?
Oh yes, everything. The craft. The craft is everything. Yeah. When you make it look so simple. I was just talking to Peter this morning about, Archie once asked me to talk about the poem that kind of got me writing. What early poem got you really interested in poetry? And I said the one that really set me alive was Krapp's Last Tape. And they said, well, it's not really a poem. Well, I said, it's 11 pages long, and if looked at in certain light, it is a magnificent poem. And so every different things can be different things to different people. But
we have Sam Beckett looking at you over there.
Actually, in his photograph. That's a great.
Very good. Okay, well.
So just what I tell you about this poem.
Yes, please.
A Blessing on Things Made Well. Theo Dorgan and Pat Bourne put together an anthology called What We Found There, and it was you had to go to one of the museums in Ireland, look at things, right, and pick something and write about it. So I went into the museum in Dublin and I walked around, and it was full of old stuff. So nothing really set me alight. And then I was going up to Lewisburg, I think it was, in the car, and I saw the sign for the Museum of Country Life, and I went in there. I found that full of stuff you could write about. And first of all, I looked through this door and it had a vintage classroom. And I turned to my wife, Mary, and I says, "Vintage classroom? That's my classroom." And she said, "Well, Tony, you went to school 50 years ago, right? That is a vintage class." And the difference is those. I wrote a poem about the little seats that were like Ryanair flight. You had to, you remember you squeezed into them, and when the chap was hitting you, you couldn't get out. And but I stuck a pony into that poem, and that's at the time I was writing a book about ponies.
Which is behind you there.
My pony, yeah. So I said I better not give that to them, and then I went down into the basement of the, and there in this glass case was a set of uilleann pipes, and over it some officious civil servant had written, "Michael Egan made these pipes in 1850, approximately in the key of C." And I was looking around to kick him. I wanted to kick him in the ankle. I thought, what? Imagine you've been making a set of uilleann pipes, and then somebody saying, "Yeah, not bad, right?" Yeah. So I wrote a poem about that, and I read it now for all the musicians out there. A Blessing on Things Made Well. Michael Egan made a set of uilleann pipes in 1850. Now they lie silent in a glass display case at the Museum of Country Life, under a sign that says, "Approximately in the key of C." I love the beauty of those words. You can't but admire the care and precision Michael put into making these pipes, as tuned to this life as possible. For isn't everything, if looked at closely, a little off key? Lovers and dancers only a step out, a step away, talkers on the tips of their tongues, towns at no distance, doors and drinkers slightly ajar. I'd like a copy of that sign to hang on my wall, especially in winter when the poems are buckled, bent, every one of them, approximately in the key of C. So,
fantastic, fantastic. We actually brought, my mother had an enormous kind of wrought iron potato crusher that had been her grandmother's. So she had this in her possession, and she decided it had to go to the Museum of Country Life. Yeah. So we brought it down there. So somewhere, I don't know if anybody's written a sign about it yet, but there's this enormous, I think it was made in Liverpool in 1913 or 14 or something or other, and it's just it's a beautiful, enormous kind of potato crusher.
Well, the pipes are now gone from the Museum of Country Life.
Where are they
gone?
Yeah,
they're gone to the pipe Museum in Belfast.
Ah, okay.
And I was talking to the man who runs that, and he told me they're in storage now. Yeah. But he says, if you come up anytime, just knock on the door, show them your poem, and we'll get the pipes out and you can see them.
And they might be certain about whether they are in the key or C or not at that point.
But some musicians say to me that all the pipes, you slide to the note. That it isn't, it's a silly kind of thing to put up. Yeah.
Have you tried playing the uilleann pipes?
I played the pipes for 7 or 8 years, you know. Yeah. I did. My brother Joe still plays the pipes. I love them. The reason I stopped playing them was like in those days, maintenance was a big problem, and I'm not very handy, because my brother Joseph is. But I'll tell you this now, about maybe every year, every 2 years, I meet a friend of mine, and I borrow his pipes, and I have a squawk. And I had a squawk last October in Glanty's at a fiddle weekend. A friend of mine, Sheila Field, was over from Glasgow, and I tried to tune in her pipes. But I'll tell you about pipes. Like I'm nearly always thinking tunes in my head and thinking fingering on the fiddle or fingering on the pipes or whistle. And strangely enough, I would find I play more music non-physically than physically, because I'm always thinking. Like, what would it be like if you did this? How would that feel on the pipes? Yeah. So I never feel any strangeness if I pick up a fiddle and I haven't played for a while, because the fingers are half expecting it, and it's the same with the pipes.
Could you maybe give us a couple of tunes now?
I will indeed. Just thinking back to when we were talking there about memory. One of the most astonishing displays of memory I saw was on Christmas Eve 1982 in a kitchen in a house up in Kilcar in Donegal. And there was a man, Francie Byrne. Francie would have been well up in his 70s then, but to cut a long story short, a few of us called in on a visit, kind of late at night, maybe 10 or 11 o'clock at night on Christmas Eve, and Francie was getting ready for midnight mass. He was shaving when he heard there was a fiddle player in the house, down tools. And he came into the kitchen, and before long he started playing tunes on the fiddle. Now at that stage, I would say I was fairly well up on the repertoire, so I thought. But Francie played standing up for somewhere between 5 and 7 hours.
God, you're like Keith Richard.
Good Lord.
And I'll tell you this, I've often said this to people, if I knew like one tune out of 10, I was doing okay. It was an astonishing display, and that was stuff that was just top of mind. Yeah. You know, I called back to visit Francie several times, and he might just start talking about jigs or hornpipes or highlands or something, and just play away at those. And it was an amazing thing. You know, when
and
you were
was he captured? Did anybody record him? Or?
Yeah, there's some recordings made of Francie and his brother Mickey Ban O'Byrne. They had a marvellous way of playing two fiddles in unison, and then one of them might play in octaves or do these really unusual drone sounds on the fiddle. So it's the most exotic sound you could hear, you know, and you could hear a very strong bagpipe influence on some of Francie's music as well. But just the output of what that man had in his head, and then he played tunes that nobody else knew. So that, of course, has us all thinking: did he compose them? And there's this great unspoken thing with a lot of traditional musicians, especially of an older generation. Like it's a bit modesty and diffidence. They would never really tell you if they composed.
And you don't ask.
That's
you know, and people might say, that was always played around here, but then nobody else knew it. Or, you know, the folkloric side of it would be, we got that from the fairies, or the magic fiddler we met, or the magic piper. You know, so there's a great world attached to this music. There's a great element of, like, there's a permanent degree of fantasy goes with it, you know, because you just can't nail it down. Like when Tony read his poem there, approximately, in the key of C, like that nails so many of the you might say the culture clashes or the knowledge clashes when you have a rational system, so called, and then someone that's so that looks so disordered as traditional music. It's got just a different set of rules. So approximately in the KSC, who cares?
Robbie Burns, when he talked about himself, and people said, "Did you write that?" He says, "I'm a mender of old tunes, maker of new." And that's what Dermot's talking about. A mender of old tunes, maker of new. You know, so he was Old Lang Syne. Did you write it? I think he added one or two words to it. But it was still, if you see who his name is put underneath it, but he wouldn't have ever claimed to have written it.
So you're in the tradition, but you're adding to it.
You're adding to it. He always, you know, just.
Well, I think see that thing about adding to it. I think that's why some players are remembered more than others. Actually, it's because they've enriched or enhanced something that's been old, and sometimes tunes that maybe were a wee bit neglected or threadbare. I mean, I heard somebody describing the late John Doherty's fiddle playing one time, that he could, hearing John take an old hackneyed tune and play it, it was like somebody walking past a withered plant or a faded plant, and it just sprung into life. A beautiful image, you know. And I think that's one of the great things about, like, tunes don't actually die and vanish. You know, they stay. They do stay around, a bit like humans, I suppose. Like we're always around in some form. And I think, when you look at all of the unanalyzable elements of like an oral tradition, like traditional music, or maybe the magic of making poems as well. There's a whole lot of that stuff you can't really say. Well, you do this, you do that, and you get that. It doesn't really work in that linear way. And that's a thing that interests me when I'm teaching as well, because when students, especially like maybe more mature students coming from other musical cultures, when they realise that one of the rules of making progress on traditional music on the fiddle is that you have to forget a lot of rules and try and adopt different kinds of norms. I wouldn't say they're rules. They find that sometimes either a massive challenge or a great liberation. And I've worked with people from orchestral backgrounds, jazz backgrounds, orchestral teachers, string quartet players, and so many of them have said, there's something kind of liberating about being able to go into the music this way, because the technique isn't radically different, they're just inflected in different ways. So it's helping people pick up, I would say, the phonology and the accent of Irish music is what that's all about. There aren't magic tricks. And
will you show us a bit of magic now?
Well, this is approximately
approximately the key of
perfectly in tune.
This here's a jig, a version of a jig called the Wedding Jig, and it's another one. It's a tune that's associated with a man called Frank Cassidy, and again, it's a tune that there's not a vast amount known about. Had Frank not been recorded playing it back in the 1970s, I don't know, would the tune still be going. It's one of those hit and miss things. Maybe he composed it. Who knows? It's called the Wedding Jig.
So it would be a great way to follow that with, you have a poem about a Sliabh Luachra session.
I have a Sliabh Luachra session. It's kind of an accidental poem. It's probably a strange little poem. I was asked to introduce one of the network sessions, music network sessions, which are a great thing that they tour Ireland every year, and they came to Clifton Festival, so they asked me to introduce them. Now, I wouldn't be the best at introducing the likes of Dermot. They're much more better introducers. I would be better doing the poetry. So I put all my stuff together, and I introduced Paddy O'Connor, Aoife Cueve, Mick O'Brien and Melanie Cronin. I introduced them, and that was grand. But just when they came on, as they passed me, they said, "Now, Tony, there'll be a 20-minute interval and you'll have to reintroduce us for the second half. As I sat listening to them, I said, how am I going to reintroduce them? I've used up everything. And as I sat there in the dark, it must have been the shadows of the afternoon, listening to them, I wrote this poem, and I used it to introduce them in the second half. So it's called Tunes Carried on the Night Air. The sleeve Lurecrab barn lifts her wooden skirt, dusts herself down, then dances to reels and jigs. Her shuffling feet wake the fox in the field, the blackbird in the trees. Their sudden scatter revives the drunk, floating along in the dark, heading home. Play on, he shouts. We have the moon on the run, and I can see my old father dancing, cracking the flags. He loved to see a barn dance, a moon waltz, a man raise his glass to the piper, the fiddler, the box player and the singer. Play on, lads, he shouts, play on.
That's superb.
That was just for the...
That's
then they came back on stage and
superb.
It got me out of it.
Well, gentlemen, it's been fantastic to chat to you about both. It kind of was striking me there that okay, you know, we can give out about technology and the internet and all that stuff, but in a way, maybe we're getting closer to the oral tradition that all of this came out of again, because it's not just the words on the page anymore. We can do things like this. We can, you know, record, we can capture, we can put it out there so that people can hear again, which is good. So you promised that you could maybe join forces musically to finish off.
Now,
so
this is like I seem to end up with these great musicians like Dermot and John Sheehan, and then I like playing, but I don't usually play with other musicians or vice versa.
And just actually while they are tuning up, I will say you've been listening to the second episode of the Attic Sessions. We will be airing again in about a month's time, when we will be looking at a very different topic, the Irish crime fiction, and we'll be doing that in the company of Louise Phillips and Paul Perry. But wonderful to get one final taste of the musical talents of Mr. Dermot McLaughlin and Mr. Tony Curtis.
This is an old song. I do it in the schools because Ed Sheeran has taken to doing it. It might have been sung by Shakespeare. Of all the money e'er I had, I spent it in good company, and all the harm that ever I done, alas, it was to none but me, and all I have done for want of wit, to memory now I can't recall. So fill to me parting alas, good night and joy be with you all. they'd wish me one more day to stay. But as it falls onto my lot that I should rise and you should not, I will gently rise, softly call good night and joy be with you all.
Woo!
I like that. We did the rehearsal and the performance at the one time.
That was fantastic.
Yeah.